Hi, I'm Caleb Sundance, and I'm interviewing Elaine Philips, an associate professor of English at Tennessee State University, about fanfiction. Dr. Phillips talked about fanfiction as a legitimate literary form at the AWP annual conference in Boston. She had some really great points, and I had some further questions for her. So without further ado, here's the interview. Hello, Elaine. How are you?
I'm fine, Caleb. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Great. The semester's almost done, and I'm looking forward to writing lots of fan fiction and answering your questions.
Why do you think fanfiction isn't respected more?
I think it goes to ideas of originality, and I think that stemming from 18th century British literature, kind of in the 1740s, there's a shift in what constitutes kind of literary genius. And it seems to go from having like a classical education, being extremely knowledgeable about classical mythology and literature, and being able to master certain forms, saying something that's already been said before, but doing it in a very different way or doing it in a really well done way, to around 1740s, kind of a switch to the idea that genius must be original, and that literary talent, someone who can do something new or even look at something that's been done before in a new way, starts to take precedence. And this is where my 18th century geek comes in. I think it has to do with the novelist Samuel Richardson, who wrote Pamela and Clarissa. And he was a printer. He had a decent education, but not the kind of good education, quote unquote, that was grounded in Latin and Greek and the classics. And he was always rather defensive about that. And when when his novels became popular, people were arguing about, people either loved the novelty of them because they were novels told in letters, although that had been done before, but it was really kind of how he did it that got people excited and interested, or even anxious about this kind of new form of literature. And people would either support him or they would kind of pick on him, like, who's this mere printer, this mere businessman churning out novels, trash for young people to read. And he had a good friend, a poet named Edward Young, who kind of defended the concept of originality, the idea that, in a way, people like Shakespeare, who also did not have that classical university education, but had this great original talent and this ability to kind of do something that others were not doing, he wanted to kind of defend that as another form of genius that was superior to merely imitating or reworking the themes of classical literature or classical poetic forms. And so it's also coinciding with the time when people started looking at Shakespeare not just as a fairly successful playwright, but as kind of like the god of English drama. And you get kind of like the Shakespeare mania. So I think that starting this 18th century, there's this shift in defining genius or talent in terms of coming up with something no one's ever done before, or a topic that no one's ever looked at, or doing something in an original format. And that's good, but when you refer it back to fan fiction, then anybody who's using material that is kind of copyrighted as a springboard is seen as, oh, you're an imitator, you're a copier. And I think it has to do with the nature of fandom also, because it's not like just simply someone saying, I'm going to take Wuthering Heights and reimagine it from the first Mrs. Rochester's perspective, which is what Jean Rhys did with White Sargasso Sea, and we say that's literature. But someone taking something that is copyrighted, that they can't make money off of, and writing for kind of the amateur reason, the love of it, the desire to interact with it. Another thing that probably doesn't help also is that there's a lot of bad fan fiction out there. and you can attribute it to the fact that there are people who they're not writing because they are seeing themselves primarily as writers, but primarily as fans, and a lot of them are young too. I admit that I'm only working in the Italia fandom, and so that is by far and away a fandom of mostly teens. In Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Ring fandoms, you're going to have older people writing, probably with much better talent, a better sense of what makes the story or characters work. So, but I can say that there people feel like anybody can write and post, and so just put it up there, whether it's any good or not. So I think that kind of the perceived lack of quality, and kind of our idea that genius or talent has to be original, has kind of led to fan fiction being looked down upon, and not seen as like a legitimate literary form, even though we could argue that it goes back really to people reworking the matter of the Trojan War and the Odyssey and all these things. So.
What are some examples of excellently written books that are fan fiction?
We just mentioned Wide Sargasso Sea is kind of a reworking of Wuthering Heights. A few years ago, the writer Alice Randall wrote a kind of reworking or revision of the Gone with the Wind called The Wind Done Gone, and it's seen through the eyes of Scarlett O'Hara's half-sister, who is the daughter of a slave. So she is biracial, and that was very interesting. And that was a case where the Margaret Mitchell Trust that owned the copyright to Gone with the Wind did not approve at all, and they kept throwing injunctions at the publisher and the author. But finally, the book got published by, I think it might have been Harper Row. I can't remember, but those are some examples. And I think that in some way that when you're dealing with, Wicked by Maguire.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thinking about a reworking of The Wizard of Oz. Mm-hmm. And I guess one thing is where we can say, well, what makes those kinds of works that people can say, wow, that's original, or that's a different way of interpreting the material? What makes that acceptable versus the vast run of fan fiction? And I think it might have to do with audience and whether the material is copyrighted or not. Mm-hmm. And I think it also has to do with the kind of quality and intent of what the person is doing. Because if you're working with something that is out in the public domain, like the Oz books or Alice in Wonderland world, you can get away with revising it. Whereas with The Wind Done Gone, you have the legal issues of, this is not in the public domain, and you're trying to make money off of a reworking of the novel that we don't approve of. And I think that the intent, the audience is meant to be larger, not just simply fans writing for other fans of the material, but really trying to reach another audience and saying, let's rethink the time period of Gone with the Wind. Let's imagine what life on Tara was like if you were a slave versus Scarlett O'Hara. And I think that is what a lot of people would probably identify with or feel is more interesting, because then you can say, well, it's a revisionist writing. It's giving a character who doesn't have a voice or perspective that was ignored in the original source an opportunity to kind of critique and subvert what the original source said. And I think good fan fiction can do that also. It's just that I think, again, people have a perception that fan fiction is just basically taking your very favorite characters and putting them together in a bed and writing about it. And no, it can actually be more than that. It can actually do something meaningful with it. And so the whole 50 Shades of Grey, I think somebody saw that the writer was getting a lot of hits on the fan fiction site. And even though the writer herself has admitted she's not a great writer, somebody was like, there's money to be made here. Let's just get you to change the names and some things, and then, you'll have a book contract. But that kind of irritates me, because it's rewarding bad writing. Mm-hmm. It's like saying, okay, we don't care if your writing is any good or not, while there are people with MFAs and teachers of creative writing and people, having to content themselves with small presses or rejection and making no money, and here's somebody who's just I was basically writing Twilight porn.
Yeah.
A seller. Well, that says something about the American buying public.
That's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
What kind of stories do you think generate fan fiction?
Ooh. There seems like so many different sources. But I think that the ones that generate fan fiction are the ones that have characters, strong characters that people want to imagine backstories for, or kind of like unnoticed part of their histories. I think back to Star Trek, for example, the original one, and that friendship between Spock and Kirk really ignited the imaginations of people. And also like the little hint that that one kiss between Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura probably had people thinking, what got Kirk to be the way he did? What is really going on in the Spock and Kirk relationship? Mm-hmm. What if in the near future, because remember the original Star Trek was created during the 60s, what would it be like to be in the future where an interracial romance is no big deal? Or, interspecies romance, Kirk and some hot space babes. So I think it's like you have characters that kind of invite readers to imagine, missing gaps in their history and filling them in, as well as a universe where people feel that different things can happen, that it's not a closed universe where the whole story is told and everything's done, the end, but a sense that there are other adventures these characters can go into, or there are, we can go into their past or future and kind of reimagine what they're doing then. And so in some ways, I think that almost anything could be available. Now, I'm assuming that there's Mad Men fan fiction out there. And I like Mad Men, but I've never looked to see if there's a Mad Men fandom. Mm-hmm. But part of me would be like, how far could you take that? Could you take, say, some of these characters who have very brief relationships with each other and imagine something longer term? Could you imagine, what would happen if, say, Don Draper and his protege Peggy Olson actually got together romantically? In some weird way, it would almost feel like I couldn't imagine that as successfully as, say, relationships between characters in animes and alternate universes or in science fiction. It just seems a little too grounded in reality, and yet I'm sure it exists. So I think it's just like it comes down to character and setting in the sense of an open universe rather than a closed one.
That makes sense. What do you think of authors' ownership of ideas, characters, and stories?
Okay. That's all right, and that's a really good question, and it's one that I'm kind of ambivalent about, because on the one hand, I feel that we can lay the blame on kind of the growing importance of copyright and authors' rights, and that really starts again in the 18th century and kind of evolves further. It was a way to keep people from printing pirated or unauthorized editions and making money off of an author's name. And Charles Dickens, for example, had to lobby successfully for authors' rights because his characters are so popular. People were kind of imagining their further adventures and all, and people were publishing unauthorized versions of his work in the United States and abroad. And he was just like, I'm losing out on money for this. I want my money. Mm-hmm. I also think that, so on the one hand, if I were writing original material with an original character and universe, part of me would be like, well, yeah, that came from me. I don't want anyone making money off of this. But I think that, on the other hand, if people are working on just kind of getting their imaginations inspired and wanting to kind of participate in this fictional world that you created, and they're not doing it to make money, then it's no different than being a little kid and imagining, what happened after the Narnia Chronicles ends, or, the further adventures of your favorite character in a comic book or something. You're not doing it for money. You're doing it for kind of the love and the way that your imagination got awakened by that particular text or show. I think that a lot of writers are very kind of lackadaisical. I do know that someone told me that J.K. Rowling, for example, really doesn't like it when people write explicit sex scenes between her characters, because she's like, the Harry Potter series was originally meant for, tweens and young adults, and, let's not get graphic because a lot of them are reading the fan fiction. On the other hand, Anne Rice is adamant. She does not want anybody writing and posting fan fiction of her work. So I think that authors have a right to copyright, but I also think that if you try to keep copyright in perpetuity, you're really kind of screwing people over. And I'm thinking primarily of how the Walt Disney Company always keeps renewing and kind of getting the laws for copyright changed so they can hang on to Mickey Mouse's rights forever and ever and ever and ever.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
And I think what would bother me the most is that, again, if I create the original character, it wouldn't be so much the money. It would be like, what are you doing with my character? are you doing really bad, terrible things with him or her? Or are you doing cool stuff?
Yeah.
Be like more the imaginative control than making the money.
Where do you go for fan fiction?
I go to Archive of Our Own, and I also go to fanfiction.net. And fanfiction.net has... Some people have their issues with them because of the ratings, and because last summer there was like a whole purge of works that were considered inappropriate being purged. And some people are like, screw this, I'm walking away from it. And they went to either Archive of Our Own or went on to Tumblr or other venues. And I still work on fan fiction just simply because it's probably the most well-known site. So it'll have like the first group of readers going there. I also really like Archive of Our Own because it is basically put out by people who have been long-term writers in fandom and scholars of it as well. And they don't have the same kind of censoring. They will have things labeled, but they're not going to be like, this is an M rating and we therefore cannot publish it. So it's an interesting site too because it's in beta, and you have to you have to either get an invitation or ask for an invitation. You just can't simply create an account like you do on fan fiction. So that's where I go.
What sorts of things are no-nos in fan fiction communities?
I think that OC characters can be difficult because people want to see their favorite characters interacting, and when someone introduces an OC, it's often seen as a stand-in for the writer. And if it's handled well, like any fully realized character, they might go with it. But on the other hand, they might just be like, nah, I wanted to read about this character pairing, not that character and this other thing I've never heard of before. So I don't know if I would call it a no-no, but it can be kind of a something held against you. The whole Mary Sue, Marty Stu phenomenon, where you have a original character who just seems too perfect, too one-sided, too awesome, and every character in the universe falls in love with him or her, and they have everything going for them. That's a big no-no. People are just like, no, I don't want to read about this perfect being who doesn't have any struggles, and especially if that is a stand-in for the writer, because that's just at that point just turning into the writer's fantasy, writ large, rather than a plausible character interacting in meaningful, realistic ways. Character deaths, I think, are controversial because people get upset if you kill off a favorite canonical character. And I understand why people do it, because they want to create some emotional connection. They want to get people having the feels and all, but sometimes that can be controversial. Another thing I just thought of is taking somebody else's original characters and using them in your stories. Some people are flattered. Other people are, very upset by that, because they're just like, okay, you're taking my original character and you're killing them off, or you're having them involved in this kind of orgy or something, and that's not what I imagined for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then, that's also a case of, kind of like hypocrisy. It's like, but we're doing that with characters that are licensed and copyrighted. So
Yeah.
and I think that one thing is that when I was at the Middle Tennessee Anime Convention, and a friend and I led a workshop on writing better fan fiction, that question actually came up about, what do can you take other people's characters and use them? And one person said, I really don't care what you do with my character as long as you give credit to me. So I think that it's like, again, the idea that if you're going to use somebody's character, at least acknowledge that this character was originally created by so and so and appeared in their story, and then you can put them in the sex orgy and kill them at the end.
Now, I met you in Boston on a panel called Fanfiction, Video Games, and Comics, Alternative Genres as Legitimate Literature. Now, how do you think fan fiction writing is different than video game and comic writing when it comes to the amount of literary respect it gets?
I think that, again, it has to do with the kind of like the commercial aspect. A video game is something that you create and you design and you put out there in order to get people to buy it and to play it. Same thing with comics or manga. Again, it's something that you are putting out into the marketplace to be bought. Fan fiction, because of the copyright issues, you really can't do that, at least not legally. Another thing, too, is that both the video games and the comics have the visual aspect to it. So you can tell the story through visual action, through the way that the panels are arranged. And while you have fan fiction that is based on comics and manga, what I've usually seen has been basically kind of like straight up classic prose fiction. I haven't seen anyone, well, that's not fair, because in Japan you have the whole doujinshi or doujinshi subgenre, which is basically fan fiction told in manga form. So you can do that. But it seems that fan fiction in some ways could be the most literary in terms of, its prose narrative. It doesn't have visuals to help tell the story and push it along. So I think that's the main difference.
Some people consider fan fiction unoriginal. What do you think about that?
Now, I actually think that it is original. I think that it has a way of reimagining characters. I think that people can experiment with form in kind of avant-garde ways. So that can contribute to originality. It might be, you might be using characters from Lord of the Rings, but if you are basing a whole story on them based on texts between the actors in the movie and kind of reimagining them as characters or as as human beings getting wrapped up in their roles that they're playing, then I think you're doing something rather metatextual. And so I think that there is originality in imagining how to tell the story. I also think that there can be originality in how people start looking at those little unsaid moments or the backstories of characters. And that's when you can start seeing more of the writer's mind at work saying, well, if Prussia is no longer officially a country, why is he still hanging around existing? Does he represent a region of Germany? Does he represent the Holocaust? What if, the only way for this character to exist after Prussia was officially dissolved in 1947 is basically to take on the burden of being the memory of the Holocaust. That's kind of an original answer to the question of why is this character still running around when, as in the Hitalia universe, he should be dead. He doesn't exist anymore. So those, I think that it can be original, just in the way that Chaucer was original with taking two minor characters from the Trojan War cycle and writing a poetic tragedy about their love, Troilus and Cressida, or Shakespeare taking like a little short prose piece about lovers in Italy and turning it into Romeo and Juliet. So I think that there's the potential to write something original and of, merit, or at least that like gets people wrapped up with the characters and say, simultaneously, this person is in character, but you also give them a background that makes sense, but I never thought of before. Or I've always felt that this character was a particular way, but it took your story to kind of elucidate it, to make it happen. So I think that there is room for originality, either in the form in which it's told or the way that the characters are imagined, or kind of the, what is said that was not explored or said in the canon material.
What do you enjoy about fan fiction?
I enjoy getting my mind taken over by another world. I enjoy kind of getting into something, whether it's an anime or a book series, and kind of taking the characters that I like and imagining new adventures for them or new relationships for them. And that's something that I did even as a kid, because my younger sister and I both loved the original series of Oz books by L. Frank Baum.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also liked the Narnia series. So without being entirely aware of what we were doing at 8 or 9, we were basically doing Narnia Oz mashups and kind of, reimagining them, going, always finding those new countries in Narnia or Oz that they had, and new adventures. And I guess kind of learning about story and plot and character in an organic way. And I came back to Hitalia. I came back to writing basically because of Hitalia. My son likes to watch some anime, and he was really into World War II at one point. And when I saw Hitalia on Netflix, I'm like, the Axis powers as really cute guys? What is wrong with the Japanese?
Oh.
It's just like, this is insane. And there's like, this is insanely funny. And I got out of a writer's block because I found myself kind of drawn to certain characters and saying, well, let's imagine something really crazy. Let's imagine Poland and Ukraine have a wedding and they invite all the nations over to party with them. And, you think of the different gifts that they would give and their reactions and all. And then it just started like getting more serious. One character in particular making me think, what's going on with him? How does he feel now that he no longer exists? Who would he be a good matchup with? And I would read some of the fan fictions that were available, and some of them I really liked because they did go into the history of the character, or they did kind of present a different yet possible side. And others I'm just like, no. Finally I was like, I know that it's looked down upon in literary circles, but the hell with it. I'm writing some fan fiction. At least I'm writing. I'm getting my writing chops back. So that's how I felt, how I got involved in it.
Nice. It's very interesting. I like that I find it very interesting that it helped you get past writing block.
Yeah.
And got you, and this is just me talking now, but I almost feel like, and I could be completely wrong, but I almost feel like that's sort of how it always starts in a little bit, even if it doesn't last very long. You sort of like, you see a really good story and you're like, wow, that's really cool, and you want to be like in that story, or
Exactly.
or you imagine something, further, and whether or not that lasts long for you personally, or it is gone in a year or two, however long you take interest in that particular story.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's usually how it starts, because you're not gonna, that's you gotta hear a story from somewhere.
Yeah, and that's how I felt, because I felt at the time that I was like, here I am, I'm teaching creative writing at the university level. I have not published anything. I have not written anything. I am a fraud. And it was because I really couldn't think of anything that I wanted to write about. There was like no original characters, no stories came into my head. And when I would try to think of something, I'd be like, that is so freaking lame. Why does anyone want, I wouldn't even want to read this.
Oh.
and so kind of stumbling on Hitalia got me back into it kind of gave me a set of characters and then the next step was, well, now let's put these characters in a different situation, or let's imagine a different kind of relationship. And I have now found myself thinking about an original story with real characters, just simply because I've gotten back into the mode of imagining, what if these two personalities came into conflict with each other? What if they had a certain kind of relationship at a certain kind of time? So it's kind of like, it's not just limited to the Hitalia universe, but now kind of spinning off and saying, but imagine original characters with some of these traits getting involved in some of these situations. So it's helpful. And it was just like good practice to remember how to tell a story, how to build suspense, how to develop a theme, blah, yada, yada, yada. Instead of just talking about it in a class, I actually was doing it on my time.
Yeah.
Even if it's like, no way I'm going to get published beyond fanfiction.net, at least I'm doing stuff and I'm getting it out there.
Yeah. Definitely. So what fanfiction do you write?
Okay, basically I stick to Hitalia.
Okay.
And I've completed one long story so far, and I have 2 in progress.
Okay. So do you update them in installments? Is that how it goes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So with the pet, I'm updating that every Friday. I've kind of taken a little hiatus on the cuckoo bird because I got to a plot point where I was like, I need to think this out more carefully, and instead of just writing and posting and then kicking myself for like good plot moments. And also, school got in the way with grading and papers and things like that.
School.
So, yeah. I know, students are like, oh, professors, they do all this, assign us a ton of work, and we're like, yeah, and guess who has to follow up on it?
Yeah.
Especially when we have like 3 or 4 sections to teach.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I basically see it almost like a serial. Like, here comes the new chapter, ooh. And so I find myself kind of writing in kind of like endings with kind of suspense or cliffhangers, not like nonstop action, but, this chapter's ended, and now, got to find out what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
Or, we're ending on a note of dread. Will this dread play out in next week? So it's fun. Again, it's kind of going back to Dickens or Thackeray, originally publishing as, monthly serials. One of the things that I tried to do also when I was writing is that I recognized that I was writing primarily for fans, but I also wanted to think, if somebody knows the basic premise of the anime, and if willing to say, oh, okay, so the nations of the world are personified, and they kind of live among us, and they have a job, and they have these long histories, and you're going to tell me a story about 2 of them and how they got involved, I'll roll with it. I didn't want it to be so insular and so like fan-centric that if you stumbled across it, you would say, I can't get into it. Hopefully somebody would read it and be like, okay, if I buy the basic premise, and she's giving me enough information about this kind of world that she's using, I can follow the story, and I can care about the characters, and I can understand them and what they're up against and all that.
What got you into fan fiction? Hitalia and that writer's block, is that how it originated?
Yeah. And I just remember thinking that on the one hand, it's a silly anime. It's almost like a series of sketch comedies. Mm-hmm. It's not like Full Metal Alchemist or trying to think, or even Naruto or Avatar, where you've got characters in this this long arching narrative who are doing something pretty important, even though it has comic breaks. Mm-hmm. I mean, in some ways, Italia is pretty trivial, but I found myself thinking about some of the characters again and reading up on the history of the nation they represented and starting to say, that's interesting. How did this character manage to survive? Or why is this character then friends with a nation that has historically been her enemy? And so it just kind of got the what if ideas going. And it took me kind of saying, oh, what the heck? I enjoy writing these stories. I don't care if it's not kind of legitimate or established literary fiction. At least I'm writing. And I go back to that because nothing else was seizing my imagination. And I have to admit that in the past, I have had friends who were writing fan fiction for Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. And there was a part of me at that time that was like, you're a really good writer, and you should be doing some serious stuff with this. But now I am like, I'm sorry I ever thought that way about them, because there's really good stuff out there.
Yeah.
And I understand what motivated them to do that now, to kind of that desire to enter into a world and to kind of imagine or reimagine a part of it, or fill in a gap somewhere. And there's also been a lot of good cultural studies on fan fiction also, looking at it from either sociological viewpoint, cultural studies, and a lot of people talking about the value of slash, the fact that you basically have like these this male erotic fiction written primarily by and for straight women. And I'm probably more interested in the literary aspects. I'm more interested in kind of the literary precedents of fan fiction and the literary history of it, and kind of the tropes that get involved, and kind of trying to get people to see what's going on in terms of as a literary form, because there's already really good stuff being done on gender and representation and cultural and material aspects of fandoms. So I'm coming at it as kind of a literary historian / writer.
Mm. How long did you write fan fiction for until you felt you were a person that wrote fan fiction? Was it immediate?
I would say it probably felt like I probably felt comfortable with calling myself a fan fiction writer when I was 3 months into it. And one thing that helped was getting the feedback from readers on fanfiction.net. Mm-hmm. It helped because I didn't have to wait months for somebody to contact me through a publisher or come up, on a speaking tour. It was like an immediate reaction of someone saying, "Oh, I love that last chapter," or "Oh no, what's that character doing?" Or even just simply, "I really like your writing, and it's a lot better than a lot of the stuff out there." And so that was very flattering. And also, it was like taking up it was taking up time, it was taking up creative energy, and I was excited about it. And even though I'd kind of like chuckle and laugh it off, like, yeah, I know it's really stupid and all, and, I found some people, both in real life and in cyberspace, who were like, "No, that's good, that's awesome, it's nothing to be ashamed of."
Yeah.
Yeah, that made me proud. I was like, "Yay, I found my people," and and I felt more comfortable. And I think one thing that also helped too was that I was coming at it as somebody who had been in writing workshops in the past, who had an MFA in creative writing, who basically said, "I know how to write. I've done this before." Mm-hmm. As an undergrad and as a graduate student, I had won prizes for my writing. So I can do this. I just haven't had anything that has really compelled me to want to do it until this came along. So I felt like, in some ways, I felt like I was coming in at a kind of like a big advantage compared to, say, a 15 or a 16-year-old who's never taken a writing class in his or her life, but suddenly has this urge to write about these characters. Mm-hmm. I'm like I kind of felt like I was coming in, as like a skilled athlete. Like Little League. And that made me feel ambivalent. On the one hand, it was an easy ego boost, and on the other, it's kind of like, if they only knew how old and experienced I really was, they wouldn't be that impressed. And I also felt that if in some way, if I could kind of like help kind of raise the standard or elevate the game mm-hmm. of fan fiction writing in a young fandom, that would be good also.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. If people are like, "I want to write like that person, how do I do that?" Mm-hmm. And that can inspire them to take writing classes or to study books on writing or to do something to at least, improve their writing and produce better fan work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very good thing and a very good point. I really like that aspect of it.
Yeah.
Which is really what I appreciated when you spoke on the panel. I liked that a lot.
I liked it when a lot of people spoke up for beta readers and said that beta readers really serve an important purpose in looking over somebody's work before they post it. Mm-hmm. And the beta readers that are out there are not just simply looking and saying, "Oh, let me fix your English for you," but also, asking, they're doing the job of a good editor.
Uh-huh. Like,
What
why is
editors
this character doing this? Should they really
exactly
be doing this? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a cliched way of describing their character's emotions. Try to think of another way to get us to feel their anxiety or their sorrow.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what are you going to do with this plot thread? Is it going to show up later on? Because if it isn't, then cut it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're really getting the feedback that a lot of people used to get from editors and publishing houses.
Hmm.
And also that they would be getting if they were like taking a creative writing course at their school.
When you read fan fiction, if it's written well enough, are you liable to think of it as officially being part of the story?
Like it could be canon.
Yeah.
It could be like part of the official narrative.
Mm-hmm.
There was one fan fiction I read about Italia that had Germany and Prussia, and in some ways it was primarily about. I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. It had bondage, domination, sadism, submission. It was pretty explicit. It imagined the two nations as brothers, so it was incestuous on top of it. But what really concerned me was that the writer kind of imagined a way to allow his brother to have an existence after the unification of East and West Germany. And it also gave backstory on Prussia's character that actually had me in tears. And I don't know if I would go the whole route of saying, yes, the two German brothers do have this, domination, submission relationship going on, but it made a compelling case for it. It made a compelling case for kind of the barbarity of nations towards each other and the ways in which a nation's character is shaped in order to survive. So that was on Archive of Our Own, and it would have been way too sexually explicit, and I think in some ways not just mature in terms of sexual matter, but also in terms of the big issues. Mm-hmm. How do you keep somebody existing? How do you keep someone you love from fading? Are you willing to give them this kind of purpose, kind of the whipping boy relationship in order to keep them alive? And are you willing to perpetuate abuse, except now it's consensual? It was a really deep story, and as I said, it was well written, and it just had me in tears. So that would be one story that I could imagine as kind of being canon, kind of like getting at kind of like, the harshness that nations had to experience and survive in order to develop, and how it shaped their history, kind of that standing.
Sounds very intense.
Yeah, and then there's another one also that imagined that, in a way, Prussia survives by, and I mentioned this in our earlier question, where the way that Prussia survives, since he's no longer Prussia or East Germany, is as the Holocaust haunting the minds of the world. Not only Germany, but the other nations that have existed. Which, is kind of like, that's a real burden to bear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Superpower.
Oh. Time travel.
Time travel.
Time travel.
Okay. I can go right along with that one. What's something you've always wanted to do?
Okay, I've traveled abroad, but I would like to live abroad for like a year or two somewhere.
Anywhere in particular?
I would probably end up in either Eastern Europe or Northern Europe. And I know that now it's like, oh, so you're just going from one first world to another. But there's a part of it's just like, I would like to try to immerse myself in a place that I feel drawn to. Mm-hmm. So I could see, like, I would like to try living in Poland for a year or Sweden for a year and seeing if I could master the language and kind of fit in with the culture. That's all I can really think of. Or, another thing I'd like to do. I used to ride horses, so I would like to do something that I've never done before, which is basically, go on like a long distance ride through a part of the United States on a horse.
That would be interesting.
That would be interesting. It would like there would be a lot of logistics, but just like what would it be like to say travel the Appalachian Trail on horseback, or what would it be like to go through this part of the country on horseback and making sure that I have my horse taken care of and lodgings and things like that. But I think that like living abroad for a year or two in another country is probably closer to my heart.
You're in a stone hallway. You can go left or right. Which do you choose?
I would go left because I'm left-handed.
I'm sorry, you fall in a pit of starving pandas and they eat you. You should have gone right.
That's just a great way to get rid of left-handed people, huh? Once they start chewing on me, they're like, she's not bamboo, we can't eat her.
Feeling unique? I'm sorry.
What if I like managed to tame the pandas and I have my like angry hungry
No,
panda
they were too
hunt?
hungry. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I get eaten by pandas.
You get eaten by pandas. It's always going to be the same every time. So if anybody else goes left, they'll always be eaten by starving pandas.